Each hole represented a letter of the alphabet, and a piece of yarn would be used to run through the holes to spell out a message. If a letter needed to be repeated, the yarn was run through the hole in the center of the disc before going back into the repeated letter. Kind of sounds like a complicated cross stitch that has a message in it. In order to read the message, a person simply undid the yarn, writing down each letter in order as the yarn was pulled out of the various holes. The message would be written down backwards, but the coder simply had to turn the message around to read it. Another method of cryptography involved using a sheep's ankle bone, called an astragal, instead of a disc. The ankle bones had 4 flat sides and were commonly used as dice, making them common accessories. The coded astragal would be marked with dots to represent the letters of the alphabet. Each side of the ankle bone would have 6 letters on it. As with the disc, a piece of yarn would be threaded through the various letters with a needle, and when the message was finished, the ankle bone simply looked like an astragal with some yarn wrapped around it. This technique was devised by Aeneas and doesn't seem to come from other sources, unlike other techniques recorded in his book. Aeneas wasn't only concerned about sending messages, but also about the enemy passing messages and tracking this down. One way to prevent foreign exiles in a city from receiving enemy communications was to have every letter first examined by censors. Such reading of mail is standard practice in prisons across the world, and is increasingly common among shadowy intelligence agencies such as the NSA getting into emails. Most important for Aeneas, however, was the way to send messages. Pierre Berlequin writes in Hidden Codes and Grand Designs that although Aeneas wasn't the first to use optical signals, he did invent the first optical telegraph. Before the 2nd century BC, Babylonians and other ancient societies used smoke signals or mirrors. These messages were limited to basic content such as "we won" or "we lost." Horseback messengers or foot messengers were necessary for anything more complex. But Aeneas moved from these either-or signals toward a defined list. His invention may be considered a telegraph, although by no means like the 19th century invention that made long-distance and complicated communication simple and reliable. The telegraph of Aeneas worked by synchronizing the sender and receiver. This had to be done with the only device available to him, a water clock. Each party had an identical opaque earthenware vessel with a tap located at the bottom. A codebook was written on both vessels with a word or phrase that corresponded to each level of water. The technique for reading the message started with both vessels full. The two parties opened the taps together, let the water flow out from both vessels at the same speed, and close the taps at the same time. When the water was level with the intended message in both vessels, then the receiver would read the correct communication that was written on his vessel. The synchronization of the start and stop of this activity between the two parties wasn't easy. It had to be done by signal torches, so it wasn't a true telegraph. Furthermore, the torch and water system could only convey about a dozen different messages. But it was still a major tactical advantage over armies relying on more primitive means of communication. Much of Greece is hilly enough to make such a system practical, but it became more challenging in bad weather or far distances. To compensate, they used an early version of the telescope, simple hollow tubes, to concentrate the image. But it wasn't a fast method of communication. In the 1980s, students at a university in Germany tested the technology by using torches to send signals between two hills. Their top, well, if we can consider it a download speed of information in computer terms, was an average of 8 letters a minute. This is the computing equivalent of 64 bits a minute, or roughly 50,000 times slower than downloading from a pre-DSL internet modem. Of course, the primary concerns of Aeneas, as we know by the name of his book, is surviving a siege. But even this section delves heavily into intelligence gathering and trickery, or subterfuge. In the ancient world, the chief weapon of capturing a well-fortified city was to starve out its inhabitants before the invading army ran out of supplies and succumbed to starvation themselves. And this was a dicey proposition. If a city had well-fortified city walls, which any city worth its salt in the ancient world had, then a lot of times it was more dangerous to be the army putting a city under siege than to be inside the city walls themselves. In the meantime, the commander of a city under siege also had to defend its walls and gates and neutralize the incendiary attacks. The bulk of Tacitus's treatise on siege survival is on guarding against treachery. This was the most vulnerable point of a besieged city. The Spartan army brilliantly exploited this fact in 399 BC when they captured a succession of towns in Asia Minor through deceit and force, by making those on the inside think that no one was coming to help them, or that their water source had been poisoned, or other kinds of misinformation, or maybe saying that the besiegers had a huge supply of reinforcements coming. If an attacker didn't have an inside man within the city, then scaling the walls remained the most common form of assault. Aeneas recommends keeping assault ladders away from the walls by using forked poles. He describes a movable framework to do the same. Duncan Campbell notes in Ancient Siege Warfare that Aeneas heavily emphasizes the use of fire as a powerful ally to both the besieger and the besieged. It could create a smokescreen, and defenders should use fire if sheds are brought up, adding pitch, tow, and sulfur to ensure a blaze. His brief section on tunneling has led to the suggestion that the sieges of this period involved the undermining of town walls from below. However, many contemporaries would likely have looked down upon such an activity as it was seen as slave labor. So the ever-useful advice of Aeneas would still be useless to a general with elitist soldiers. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. The impact of Aeneas's tract spread across the ancient world. His writings really, in a way, created the genre of military science. Concepts such as obtaining supplies, guard rotation, tactical deployment, and uses of catapults, all of which had been done in an ad hoc fashion, were systematized. And siege towers transformed from ad hoc maneuvers to a scientific progress. Writers from the Hellenistic period onward expanded this genre. Scribes copied collections of military advice, and Byzantine authors adapted them for military manuals from the 9th to the 11th centuries, when military science experienced a renaissance. In his military manual Tactica, Byzantine general Nikephoros Orans, who fought the Bulgarians during the reign of Emperor Basil, who reigned from 976 to 1025, borrows indirectly from Aeneas and intersperses his own opinions with passages from the classical text. Aeneas was a brilliant tactician who recognized that secure communications was a crucial aspect of warfare. When a city-state's survival depended on intelligence gathering, proper cryptography and steganography were a matter of life and death for thousands. How to Survive Under Siege is a great-grandfather of today's high-end digital encryption. Although his methods of coding and message delivery are charmingly quaint by today's standards, he developed the scientific underpinnings of a field that today protects the most important secrets of the world. Shaving the heads of slaves and tattooing messages on their skulls fell out of fashion in the centuries to come, but as we're going to see when we look at the frumentarii, the growth of the Roman Empire elevated his methods from a boutique topic to a critical component of imperial security. All right, well, that's all for the Tactica. So we saw the general principles in the science of how to use cryptography and use spycraft and espionage. Now we're going to look at how these methods were actually used in the field. So we're going to look at the frumentarii, the intelligence group of the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Now let's jump up a few centuries to the reign of Emperor Hadrian. He ruled Rome at the height of its land extents, and he may have despaired at the size of his empire. He was a hands-on emperor who wanted to personally command his politicians and field commanders, but this required a daunting travel itinerary. As such, he traveled to nearly every Roman province to inspect and correct legions in the field, from Britain to Palestine, to look at fortifications and city walls and fortresses. So Hadrian left Italy for months at a time and joined campaigns that marched to the farthest reaches of his domains, including military withdrawals in Armenia and Mesopotamia, to conquests in Dacia, modern-day Ukraine. Through this emperor's efforts, he secured peace across the empire. So if that's true, why did he despair? That's because maintaining order of the empire was nearly impossible in such a massive realm. There were always fires to put out. Rome at its maximum extent had a population of 60 million and an area of 3 million square miles, nearly as large as Australia. Even with secure shipping lines and an orderly road system, travel from one province to another took weeks and even months in poor weather or during natural disasters or during the winter when the Mediterranean was mostly closed to ship travel. Furthermore, travel outside Rome was dangerous to the emperor. Claimants to the throne could overthrow him if they won the favor of the army's generals while he was away from the capital. Few Roman emperors died of natural causes in the imperial period. The majority fell to assassination. Despite these dangers, Hadrian made it clear to the Senate that travel would be a basic feature of his administration. He had staunch supporters within the upper ranks of Roman society to protect the throne while he was away, particularly military veteran Marcius Turbo. But doubts still lingered in his mind. Vultures circled his throne, jealous to don the purple toga worn by the emperor. Suddenly, an idea came to him while he was conferring with a wheat collector. Hadrian noticed that the man traveled frequently between Rome's far outposts and fraternized with men across the social spectrum. Hadrian suggested an idea to the wheat collector and asked him to pass it to his colleagues. Out of this meeting, which may or may not have happened as described, that's what some accounts describe as the beginning of the frumentarii, but it is plausible given the Roman emperor's penchant for conspiracy paranoia, this came the beginning of Rome's empire-wide spy network. It became an essential force of the empire's security apparatus. True, ancient Rome was built on the backs of its legions. The Roman army was stronger and more mobile than any other force of its time. But while the importance of legions can't be understated, they could never have achieved such great victories without Rome's sophisticated intelligence network. Prior to Hadrian's innovation, the Roman Empire only had a rudimentary spy apparatus. Military legions typically relied on scouts or their allies to gather intelligence they needed for victory or to inform them of possible attacks. During the Etruscan Wars of 300 BC, Consul Q. Fabius Maximus sent his brother, disguised as an Etruscan peasant, to win Umbrians to their local cause. He was fluent in Etruscan, a master of disguise, and able to bring Umbrian tribes into alliance. The Roman military might was usually sufficient to solve whatever problem they had once the imperial period came along. Rome was able to win fantastic victories over its enemies for centuries due to its military might and brilliant military commanders. Scipio Africanus whittled down Hannibal of Carthage through a long war of attrition in the 3rd century BC, and Julius Caesar conquered Gaul in the 1st century BC through similar use of strategy. Spies weren't a regular feature of the military at this time, but other segments of Roman society were more than happy to make use of their skills. Aristocrats built private spy networks to gather information on their enemies, hear of recent developments in the Senate chambers, and keep abreast of any social or military threats to their massive fortunes or personal safety. Their fortunes were considerable and worth protecting. Livy tells us that the rings taken from the dead Roman aristocrats after the Battle of Cannae in the 2nd century BC filled 3 bushels. Even Roman architects built mansions with security in mind. Livius Drusus's architect asked him whether he would like his house built in such a way that he would be free from public gaze, saved from all espionage, and that no one could look down upon. It wasn't until the 2nd century AD that a formal spy institution, the frumentarii, were developed. Internal conflict within the state had begun to grow worse in the period following the Nerva-Antonine dynasty of the 5 good emperors from 96 to 192 AD. In the year 193, the year of 5 emperors, murder, intrigue, and assassination engulfed Rome. The imperial leadership needed to know of any plots or intrigues against the state and stop them before they were carried out. The development of the frumentarii had its roots in earlier reforms made by Augustus Caesar in 31 BC, shortly after he defeated Mark Antony and gained control over the Roman Republic. One of his first reforms was to develop a cartography service. For Roman armies, the most important unit of military intelligence was the enemy's geographic location. It wasn't a simple matter of gathering intelligence on the topographical extents of the Roman Empire, which stretched from England to the Sahara Desert, from the Iberian coastlines to the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia. This included mapped lands and communication routes, enemy legion sizes, landmarks, and strategic objectives such as granaries or farms, which were crucial for feeding troops on the march. Until this time, the Roman legions depended on locals for topographical information or marching routes, a dangerous proposition if they wanted to prevent Roman incursions by feeding them bad intelligence. After developing the cartography services, Augustus then organized a statewide communication system, the first network of its kind to cover the empire. Augustus recognized that he had to protect himself from assassination attempts. He also developed a network of domestic spies who could inform him of plots on his life. These private spies, called delatores, were financially rewarded for uncovering conspiracies. The system worked well initially, but the incentive scheme soon corrupted the spies. Delatores informed on the innocent to collect a reward, or on each other to eliminate their competition. The delatores were also exploited by those in power